They left him to die in the snow, until 4 sisters gave him a reason to rise. The knife was still in my hand when I came to. Don't know how long I'd been down. The snow around me had gone hard-packed where I'd lain, which meant hours, not minutes. My coat was crusted on the left side where the blood had frozen, and the sky above me was the flat white of late afternoon, the kind of light that doesn't give you anything to read. I moved my fingers. They answered barely. I'd been tracking a bull elk up toward the ridge above Corwin Creek when the crow hit me. 2 of them. Young men, the paint on their faces still bright. I didn't fault them. The territory above that creek had been theirs before it was anybody's. What I faulted was my own looseness, my own head being someplace else. You let your mind wander in country like that, and the country takes payment. One of them had put a lance through my left side, just below the ribs. Didn't go deep, must have hit my coat roll, slid wide, but the bleeding had been real enough to put me down. The other had taken my horse and my traps and most of my food. They'd left me my knife, which I've always thought was either mercy or contempt, and I still can't say which. I lay there a while longer, not from weakness but from plain consideration. I was maybe 4 miles from the nearest shelter I knew, which was a line trapper's cabin on the south face of the Gallatin Range. I'd used it once, 2 winters back. It was a poor thing, 3 walls solid, one that leaked wind, but it had a stove and a floor and 4 walls counted against nothing. I didn't know if I could make 4 miles in this condition, but I knew what staying put would do. So I got up. I'll not pretend it was clean or quiet. I got up like a man twice my age, which at 34 felt like its own kind of insult. 1 knee, then the other, then hands in the snow, then standing. My left side was screaming a language I understood but didn't intend to listen to past what it was telling me. It was saying, you've lost blood, you've lost heat, you need to move slow and steady and not do anything foolish. I said back, understood. I moved. The snow was mid-shin on the flat, knee-deep in the hollows. I kept to the higher ground where I could. The wind had come down off the peaks, and it was not a friendly wind. It was the kind that finds the gap at your collar and works its way in slow and deliberate, like it is all day and you don't. I had my knife and my coat and 1 wool sock that had come half off, and that was what I had. The elk trail I'd been following was gone, my tracks in it filled in already. I navigated by the lie of the ridgeline and the way a man learns to read country after enough years in it. This slope faces south, so the cabin is on the far side of it. This draw will funnel the wind and eat my warmth. Go wide, go high, go slow. I went. Somewhere in the 2nd mile, I stopped thinking about the wound. That's not courage. That's just the cold taking over the part of your mind that registers pain, which is the only honest mercy the mountains ever gave me for free. I thought about other things instead. I thought about my father's hands, which were carpenter's hands, square and wide, and how he used to check fence posts by pressing his thumb into the wood at the base to feel for rot. I thought about a woman I'd known in Independence, Missouri 8 years prior, who had red hair and played piano tolerably well, and who had asked me once if I was going to stay. I'd said no. She'd nodded like she'd expected that, and there was something in that nod that I still carried and couldn't put down. Not regret exactly. More like knowing you made a choice and being honest about what it cost. I thought about whether anybody would find me in the spring, and whether they'd know who I was. That was the thought that made me walk faster. I found the cabin just before dark. The door was open a crack, which put ice down my back separate from the cold, because an open door in winter meant either somebody was in there or something had pushed it. I stopped at the tree line 50 yards out and watched for a solid minute. No smoke from the chimney. No tracks coming out. The snow around the door had been disturbed, but it was hard to read in the failing light. I came in slow, knife out, and the first thing I heard was a child crying. Not loud, the muffled, exhausted crying of a child who's been at it a long time and doesn't have much left. I pushed the door all the way open and stood in the frame to let what light there was fall inside. There were 4 of them. The oldest was maybe 20, 21. She was crouched in the far corner with the other 3 drawn in around her, 1 girl of perhaps 12, one of 8 or 9, and the smallest one, who was the one crying, who couldn't have been more than 5. They had 1 blanket between them, 1 gray wool blanket that they'd wrapped around the lot of them like a bundle, and the oldest one had her arms around all 3 in a way that told you everything about how long she'd been holding them together. She had a short-handled hatchet raised at me. Not threatening, that's not right. She was beyond threatening. The look on her face was the look of someone who has run out of choices, and is simply going to do whatever happens next with the tools available. It was the most purely honest face I had seen in some years. "Easy," I said. "My name is Callum Hale. I'm bleeding and I need to get warm. I've got no quarrel with you and I'm not going to make one." She didn't lower the hatchet. "There's wood," I said. "I'll make a fire first and we can settle what else after." The smallest girl, the crying one, had stopped at the sound of my voice. She was watching me with eyes that were red-rimmed and enormous. The 12-year-old had her face turned into the oldest one's shoulder. The 8-year-old was watching me with a kind of flat, assessing look that reminded me of the way a horse watches something unfamiliar, deciding. The oldest one said, "There's no wood." Her voice was flat and practical, no apology in it. I looked around the cabin. She was right. Whoever had last used this place had cleaned it out or never stocked it right. There was an iron stove against the east wall, cold as the ground, and a rusted tin bucket with maybe a cup of ash in it and nothing else. I put my knife away. "I saw Deadfall coming in. I can get wood. Can you build a fire?" She looked at me, evaluating. "I can build a fire," she said. "Then I'll get the wood." I turned around and went back out into the dark. I don't entirely know what made me do that. Part of it was simple. Without fire, we were all going to die, and getting wood was the immediate practical problem. But part of it was the look on her face. The way she'd stayed crouched over those girls with a hatchet raised, alone in an open cabin in a high-country winter, and hadn't run and hadn't quit. That kind of thing compels a man. It made me want to be useful. I made 3 trips in the dark, carrying wood by feel and the memory of where I'd seen the deadfall going in. Each trip was harder than the last. My side had gone from screaming to a low, steady burn, which is actually worse in some ways. It means the cold has your nerves and you can't read how bad the damage is. I piled what I had inside the door and then sat down against the wall because my legs told me to. She'd found a stub of candle somewhere and lit it. By the time I sat down, she had the stove crackling with a competence that told me she'd done this before many times. Small kindling first, laid in a cross, then finger-thick pieces, then the larger stuff once it was going. She didn't waste a match. She closed the stove door and adjusted the damper by sound by the change in the draw without looking, which is not something you learn in a parlor. The heat started coming. The 3 smaller girls came unfurled from the blanket gradually, like they were testing whether it was real. The littlest one crawled toward the stove, and the oldest said, "Not too close, me," without looking up from the fire, and me stopped where she was told and put her small hands out toward the warmth. I watched all this from the floor with my back against the wall. The oldest one finally turned and looked at me directly. In the candlelight, she was not the frightened girl she'd appeared to be in the darkness. She was thin, they were all thin, but her face had structure to it, cheekbones and a jaw that said this was not a soft woman regardless of her age. Her hair was dark and had been braided some time ago and had mostly come loose. Her eyes were dark too, and steady, and they landed on the frozen blood on my coat with the particular steadiness of someone who has seen enough bad things to have stopped flinching at them. "You need to let me look at that," she said. "I'm all right." "You're not," she stood up from the stove. "Where did it hit you?" "Lance, below the ribs, left side." "It's not as bad as it looks." "Let me see it." I can't tell you exactly why I let her. Partly I was too tired to argue. Partly the cold had compromised my thinking more than I knew at the time. But there was also just something in the way she said it, not a request, not a plea, just a plain statement of what was going to happen, that didn't leave much room for refusal. I pulled my coat open. The wound had bled through my shirt, and the shirt had frozen to the skin around it. She crouched in front of me with the candle and looked at it without expression. "I need to clean this," she said. "Do you have anything?" "Pack's gone, I've got nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the blanket and pulled something from a fold in it, a small brown bottle half full. She held it up so the candle caught it. "Carbolic acid," she said. "My father was a doctor." She said it plain, with no pause after it, which told me her father was dead and that she'd decided not to dwell on it. "That's going to hurt," I said. "I know." She worked in silence. She pulled the shirt away from the wound with more care than I would have managed on myself, and she washed it out with the carbolic, and I made no sound because there were 3 small girls watching me, and I was not going to make a sound in front of them. My hands found the floor planking and pressed into it hard, and that was all the sound I made. The 8-year-old, the one with the assessing eyes, came and stood beside the oldest one and watched the whole procedure with the same flat interest she'd had before. "Is he going to die?" she asked. "No," the oldest one said. "Hand me that cloth." The 8-year-old pulled a strip of cloth from somewhere. I later found out it was a piece of her own underskirt, and handed it over without hesitation. "What's your name?" I said to her. It was easier to talk than to breathe through the carbolic. "Dory," she said. "That's Nell," she pointed to the 12-year-old who hadn't moved from the corner, "and you already know me, and she's Elsa." She pointed to the oldest one. Elsa didn't look up from what she was doing. "Hold still." "Holding still," I said. She wrapped the wound with a tightness that meant she understood the point was pressure, not just covering. She tied it off with a neat square knot and then sat back on her heels and looked at me. "You need to stay warm," she said, "and not move around more than you have to." "I'll keep that in mind." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I don't think you will." She wasn't wrong. I must have slept, because there was a point where the candle was on the floor and the cabin was warm, and all 4 of them were asleep under the blanket near the stove. Mee had gotten herself tucked between Elsa and Dory and was making the small, rhythmic sounds a deeply sleeping child makes. Nell had her knees drawn up. Elsa had her arm over all 3 of them, even in sleep. I sat with my back against the wall and the knife across my knees, and I watched the cabin until first light. Not because I was worried. The crow who'd taken my horse had what they'd come for. This was not their fight. I watched because it was my habit, and because I was still running a low fever by then and sleep was difficult, and because there was something about watching 4 people sleep in safety that I found I needed to keep looking at for a while. By morning, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cold was coming back in through the bad wall. I got up slow and fed the stove from the remaining wood. My side was stiff, and the movement cost me, but it was honest pain. The kind that means things are working the way they should, not the gray, spreading pain that means something's wrong underneath. When Elsa woke, she found me crouched by the stove with my hands around a tin cup I'd found under the floorboard. No coffee in it, just warmth. She looked at me for a long moment like she was running some kind of calculation. "You stayed up," she said. "Wasn't tired." She looked at the stove, at the coals I'd just stoked, and didn't say anything about the lie. She got up carefully so as not to wake the others. She came and crouched by the stove beside me. She was wearing what she'd been wearing the night before, a heavy canvas coat 2 sizes too large, men's boots that had been stuffed at the toe with rags, and that braid half undone. She held her hands to the warmth. "Where are you headed?" she said. "Nowhere presently, you." "West," she said. "Fort Benton eventually, we have an uncle there." "Fort Benton is 140 miles. "I know how far it is." I looked at her. "What happened to your village?" She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had come up again and was working the loose wall. "Raided," she said. 3 days ago, we were at the creek fetching water when it happened. When we came back," she stopped, looked at her hands. "We took what we could carry." "Which was 1 blanket. "And the carbolic." She almost smiled again. It came and went the same way, quick, like she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed it. "My father kept it in his coat pocket. It was the coat I grabbed." I thought about that. A girl grabbing her father's coat in the middle of smoke and ruin and everything burning down. The carbolic acid still in the pocket. "Your father taught you medicine," I said. "Taught me what he could." She looked at the fire through the stove grate. "Taught Dory too some. Dory's got a head for it." "Dory's got a head for most things, by the look of her." That got a real small sound out of her, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. "She does. She's terrifying, honestly. She's 8 years old, and she argues like a barrister." "Nell's the quiet one." "Nell is still," she paused. "Nell saw more than the rest of us. She was closer when it happened." She said it without drama, just fact. We sat with that a while. "You know this country," she said eventually. "Some of it. Is there a way to Fort Benton that doesn't go through the high pass?" "There's a lower route. Longer, adds 4, maybe 5 days." "Can 4 people walk it?" I looked at her, 4 people and me. She looked back at me with that same flat evaluation she'd had the night before when I was standing in the door. You don't owe us anything, she said. No. You got yourself to shelter, that's what you came for. It was. She waited. I'm not going to Fort Benton to pay a debt, I said. I'm going because leaving 4 women and girls in a leaking cabin in November in the Gallatin Range is not something I'm able to do. That's all it is. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they've decided to accept something without making more of it than it is. We'll need food, she said. I know how to get food. I know, she said. I watched you come in last night. You move like somebody who knows this country. That surprised me that she'd watched, that she'd been reading me from the beginning. I've been in it a while, I said. How long? 6 years. She looked at me differently then, not with admiration exactly. With the particular respect that comes from understanding a number. 6 years in the high country was not a casual thing, and she knew it. All right, she said. We'll need food and we'll need to fix that wall. I'll take the wall first, I said. Before the girls wake up, less wind in here before breakfast is worth having. She nodded, and then quietly she said, Thank you, Callum. It was the first time she'd said my name. I don't know what it is about hearing your own name from a particular mouth at a particular moment, but it lands different than you expect. I went and fixed the wall. We spent 2 days in that cabin before we moved. I needed the time to be honest with myself about my wound, whether I was going to be an asset on this journey or a liability. By the end of the 2nd day, I was willing to call myself an asset, narrowly. The fever had broken the first night. Elsa changed the dressing each morning with that same quiet competence, and each time it looked a little better, which I tried not to make too much of but noted. I hunted both mornings. The first morning I found a rabbit run in the snow east of the cabin and took 3 of them with snares I made from my bootlaces and a strip of the dead trapper's old rope I found coiled on a peg inside. The 2nd morning I went out before dawn and waited in the trees above a frozen creek until a doe came down to paw at the ice, and I took her with a deadfall drop I'd rigged the night before from a notched sapling and a heavy branch. That was more work and it cost me. I felt it in my side dragging her back, but it meant we left with smoked meat enough for the road, which changed the arithmetic of the journey considerably. Dory helped me with the smoking. She watched the process once, then took it over, adjusting the distance from the fire with the same air of informed authority she brought to everything. At one point she said to me without looking up, You're doing the meat too close. You want it dried, not cooked. I know, I said. Then why are you doing it too close? I moved the rack back. She nodded with the satisfaction of a much older person whose correctness has been acknowledged. Me stayed near me most of those 2 days. She was 5 and had apparently made a decision about me that she did not feel the need to explain or defend. She would appear at my elbow when I was working and watch silently, and sometimes she would hand me things, a stick, a piece of bark, a small stone, with the gravity of a person who believes she is assisting. I accepted everything she handed me and said thank you and meant it, and she seemed to feel this was the appropriate arrangement. Nell was harder. She spent most of those 2 days at the far end of the cabin with her knees drawn up, watching the door. She ate when Elsa put food in front of her. She didn't talk. Elsa didn't push her, and I took my cue from Elsa. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Nell came and sat beside me while I was sharpening the hatchet blade on a flat river stone I'd brought in. She sat close enough that her shoulder nearly touched mine. She didn't say anything. I kept working the blade. After a while she said, very quietly, Are there bad men on the road to Fort Benton? Some, I said. The road has its share. She was quiet. I've been on it before, I said. I know what to watch for. She looked at my hands on the hatchet. You know how to fight. Well enough. She looked at the door for a while, then she said, Then I'm glad you're coming. She got up and went back to her corner, but something in her shoulders had changed, something in the set of them fractionally less tight. It was a small thing, and she wouldn't have said it was anything, but I carried it. Elsa watched this exchange from across the room. She didn't say anything about it, but when I looked at her, she held my eyes for a moment with an expression I couldn't read entirely, except that it wasn't unfriendly. We left before first light on the 3rd day. I'd made packs for the 3 younger girls from rope and canvas I'd found in the cabin, light ones, nothing too heavy, sized to a child's back. Elsa carried the smoked meat and the carbolic and the blanket rolled and strapped across her shoulders. I carried what was left. We moved slow the first day. I set the pace by me, who had short legs and a will to use them that exceeded her reach. She did not complain. I'm not sure she knew how. She simply walked until her legs gave out, and then I picked her up, and she rode on my back the rest of that afternoon with her hands gripped in my coat collar, which is how we managed the 3rd mile of that first day. My side talked to me the whole way. I did not talk back to it. We camped that night in a dry ravine with a granite overhang that blocked most of the wind. I got the fire built low and shielded so it gave heat without much light. Elsa made a thin broth from a bit of the smoked meat and the snow melt water I'd heated in the tin cup, and it was not much, but it was warm and it was something. Me ate hers and then fell asleep against my left leg while I was still sitting up. She was asleep before she was fully lying down, the way only small children can manage. I looked at Elsa over the fire, and she was already watching me. "How's the side?" she said quietly so the girls wouldn't hear. "It's fine. You're favoring it." "I know I'm favoring it, it's fine." She reached across and I held still while she pressed 2 fingers carefully along my ribs, not the wound itself but around it, reading the tissue beneath. Her face gave nothing away. She'd done this clinical thing from the beginning and I'd noticed it and I appreciated it. She wasn't gentle about it in the way that's actually pity. She was just thorough. "No heat," she said. "No swelling past yesterday." She sat back. "It's doing what it should." "I know." "You don't know," she said. "You'd have said it was fine either way." "I didn't argue that." "You carried me 3 miles today," she said. "She weighs nothing." "You still carried her 3 miles on a puncture wound 2 days old." She said this not as a reproach and not as praise, just as a fact she was putting into its proper place. "We could have stopped earlier. We needed the miles. We needed them and you made them happen." She looked at the fire. "I'm aware of that." I didn't know what to do with that, so I kept quiet. After a while she said, "My father was like that. He would not admit when he was hurting. My mother said it drove her to madness." "It probably did." She said it was the most infuriating and also the most reliable thing about him. She looked at the fire. That when things went wrong, he would just keep going without making a performance of it. You always knew where he was because he was always where he was supposed to be. She said this like she was talking about him in the present tense, and then caught herself, and the small catch was the only thing she allowed herself before she moved on. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll take first watch." "You don't need to." "Get some sleep, Callum." I lay down. Me adjusted herself against me without waking. I listened to the fire and the wind above the ravine and was asleep inside of 3 minutes. The second day and the third were harder. The lower route I'd chosen avoided the high pass, but it didn't avoid the cold or the distance or the particular demoralization that sets in around mile 2 of a long march when the body has been at it for days and the destination is still abstract. Dory began to limp on day 2, a blister on her right heel, badly placed, the kind that makes every step a small negotiation. She told no one. I only found it when we stopped for midday, and I noticed she was standing in a particular way, and I'd seen that particular way before. I looked at it and told her to sit. She sat with the reluctance of a person who considers sitting an admission of failure. "We can pat it," I said. "It'll hurt less." "It doesn't hurt," she said. "Dory." She looked at me. "It's all right to say it hurts." She looked at the blister with the analytical expression of someone examining evidence. "It does hurt," she said, as if this were a medical finding rather than a complaint. "It hurts considerably." "Then we'll fix it." We packed it with a strip of rabbit fur I had from the trapping. She tested the foot against the ground, adjusted her face, declared it adequate. We moved on. Nell had come forward in herself over those days. Not fully, she still went quiet in the evenings and still watched doors, but she had begun to talk. Small things, careful things, the name of a creek she'd crossed before, the way snow smelled different above 6,000 feet, whether she thought the clouds were carrying more weather. She walked beside me sometimes in the afternoons. I didn't push her toward anything. I just let her walk and said whatever it seemed worth saying and let the rest go. On the 3rd afternoon, she said, "Do you think our uncle will be there?" "You have reason to think he won't." "He moves around," she said. He's a factor for a trading company. Fort Benton is where he was last spring. That's a good reason to go to Fort Benton, I said. If he's not there, the trading company will know where he is. She thought about this. What if they don't? Then we'll figure the next thing. She looked at me. What does we mean in that sentence? I thought about it. Means I won't leave you somewhere unfinished, I said. She walked on beside me for a while, quiet. Elsa said not to get used to depending on you, she said. Did she? She said men who are good in a crisis are not always good when the crisis is over. She said to be grateful and not to cling. Elsa's not wrong to say that, I said. But you're not going to leave us unfinished. No. Then Elsa was warning us about a different kind of man. Maybe. She considered this for another quarter mile. Then she said, in a tone that was purely and completely Dory's tone, which had somehow migrated into Nell over these days, I'll tell her. I almost laughed, not quite, but close. On the fourth night, we had trouble. I'd been watching a set of tracks paralleling ours since midday, shod horse tracks, 2 animals, keeping a consistent distance. Not a coincidence. Someone had picked us up sometime around noon, and had been content to match our pace. I didn't say anything to the girls. I told Elsa after the others were asleep. She listened with her arms wrapped around her knees, her face entirely still. How far back, she said. Half a mile maybe, been there since noon. What are they waiting for? Could be a lot of things. Could be they want the firelight to run down before they move. Could be they're not sure what they've got and they're being cautious. I looked at the fire. Or they're waiting for a third man to come up. She looked at me. What do we do? Right now, nothing. I don't want to move in the dark with 3 girls to manage. I've got the hatchet and my knife. If they come in, I want them to come into the firelight where I can see them. And if there are 3 of them, then there are 3 of them. She looked at me steadily. I can use the hatchet. I know you can. I'm not just saying that. I know that too. We sat with it for a moment. The fire had burned down to a low bed of coals, and the darkness outside the ravine was total. Callum, she said, if something happens to you, don't. I need to say it. Elsa. She stopped. She was looking at the coals. I've been responsible for 3 lives for 4 days, she said quietly. And I've been frightened every minute of it. I haven't said that to anyone. I haven't said it to them. But I need you to know that when you came through that cabin door, even with the blood and the knife, she stopped. Go ahead, I said. I thought maybe we're going to be all right. She said it flatly, like it embarrassed her. That's all. I just thought maybe we were going to be all right. The fire made its small sounds. We're going to be all right, I said. She looked at me then. In the light of the coals, she looked older than 21 and younger at the same time. The way people look when they've stripped off every pretension, and you're just seeing the actual person underneath. I believe you, she said. I cannot tell you exactly what that did to me. It wasn't a grand thing, she said it quiet, almost matter of fact, and she was already looking back at the fire. But I had been in the mountains 6 years, and before that in a war, and before that in a family that had found me mostly unremarkable, and I can count on one hand the number of times someone had looked at me and said, I believe you, and meant, I believe in your ability to hold a thing together. That was what she meant. I could hear it. I held on to that through the night. The men, there were 2, no third appearing, came in an hour before dawn. They came into the fireside, which told me they were not skilled at this, or they were drunk, or they were careless enough to think a man, a woman, and 3 sleeping children presented no particular problem. Probably the last one. I was behind them when they reached the fire. I won't say more about it than that it was not a long engagement. They were saddled tramps, opportunists, the kind that work the roads between settlements when the weather drives out legitimate travelers. They had knives. I had the hatchet and a considerable advantage, which was that I'd been awake the whole night and they'd slept until an hour before. They ran. I came back to the fire, and Elsa was standing with her back to the sleeping girls, and the hatchet in her hand, and her whole body braced. She looked at me. She looked behind me at the empty dark. She let out a breath that was not entirely steady. I sat down across from her. I had a cut on my right forearm, nothing serious. One of them had gotten lucky in the dark before I got the hatchet around. I held it against my knee. She came and knelt in front of me without a word, and began to wrap it with the last of the cloth she'd been using for bandage material. "You're running out of bandage," I said. "I know," she kept working. "The other one's fine," I said. "The side." "I know." She tied off the arm. She didn't move. She stayed kneeling in front of me, her hands on my forearm, looking at the wrapping she'd just done. "Elsa," I said. She looked up. She was close. The fire was behind her, and her face was in shadow, and what I could see was her eyes, which were dark and steady and tired, and something else I didn't have a clean word for. She put her hand on the side of my face. It was not a tentative thing. It was the same way she did everything, deliberate, honest, without performance. Her palm was warm against my jaw, and she held it there, just held it there and looked at me. I put my hand over hers and held it in place. We stayed like that for a while. The coals breathed. Somewhere in the dark, a bird made a sound it makes before dawn. "Get some sleep," I said finally. "I've got the watch." She lowered her hand. She nodded once. She went and lay down with the girls, and I watched her get her arm back around them in the dark, and then I turned my face back toward the perimeter and kept watch until the sky grayed. We reached Fort Benton on the afternoon of the 7th day. It was bigger than I'd expected. Or maybe I'd simply been in the high country so long that any settlement felt large. Main Street rutted deep with wagon tracks, the trading post fronting the river, a hotel with a sign that had lost 2 letters, a scattering of mud brick buildings along a cross street. The river was running steel gray under a thin skim of ice at the edges. The girls were quiet coming in off the trail. Me had been on my back the last 2 miles, and she was asleep, genuinely asleep this time, her cheek against my neck and her breathing slow and even. Dory was walking beside me, studying the town with the evaluating look she brought to everything. Nell was behind us with Elsa, close to Elsa's side. The trading company was easy to find, the biggest building built to last, with the company name in new paint above the door. The factor was a broad, sandy-haired man named Holt who came out from behind his counter when Elsa said who she was, and his face did something complicated, and then he came around the counter and took her by both hands and said her name, and then the girls' names in the voice of a man who has been genuinely worried. He knew all 4 of them. He'd been expecting word for weeks. He shook my hand. He held it longer than most men do when they shake hands, gripping it with both of his, looking at me directly. He didn't say much. He said, "You brought them through." "They did most of it," I said. He shook his head. "I'll hear the whole of it later." He kept my hand. "Whatever you need in this town, you come to me." He took the girls inside. There was warmth and food, and someone he called to come help, a large woman with an apron who made a sound of alarm, and then immediate competence when she saw the state of them. Me woke up when the warmth hit her and looked around with the completely trusting look of a child who expects the world to be all right and is generally not wrong about this. I stood in the doorway and watched them go in. Elsa stopped at the door to the back room and turned. She came back to me. She was still wearing her father's coat. She still had the braid half undone, though it had been redone at least once on the trail. She stood in front of me and looked at me directly. "Are you leaving now?" she said. "Hadn't decided." She looked at me steadily. "Then don't decide right away." "Elsa, I know you're a man who goes," she said. "I know that about you. Nell told me what you said about not leaving us unfinished. I'm not asking you to stay on that account. That debt is paid." I waited. "I'm asking you," she said, "because I'd like you to." It was that plain. No performance, no plea, no embellishment. She wanted me to stay, and she decided to say so, which with Elsa was a rare and serious thing. I looked at her for a long moment. 6 years in the mountains. The red-haired woman in Independence who had asked if I was going to stay and to whom I'd said no. Every winter camp and every hard crossing and every morning I'd woken up in the cold and found myself still alone and told myself that was what I'd chosen, and that was what suited me. "For how long?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "Long enough to find out." I took a breath of Fort Benton air, which smelled of river and smoke and horses and all the particular human smells of a town, which I'd mostly been away from for a long time. "All right," I said. She nodded once, the same as she'd nodded the first morning in the cabin, accepting something without making more of it than it is. But her eyes stayed on mine for a moment longer, and in them I saw what I'll call relief, though that's a small word for it. It was the look of someone who has been holding a thing very carefully for a long time, and has just been given permission to put it down. She put her hand in mine, plain as that, and we went inside. That was nearly 30 years ago. Fort Benton is a different place now. The trading company Elsa's uncle ran became a family thing. He brought her brother-in-law into it, and then a few years later brought me. I know this country, and I know the roots into it and what comes out of it and what the tribes need and will trade for, and that turned out to be worth something. A different kind of worth than I'd been practicing in the high country, but not lesser. Dory is a physician. She got her training in St. Louis and came back. She is exactly as terrifying as Elsa said she was at 8 years old, and 3 times as right about things. Me is teaching school in a town a day's ride east. She writes me letters that are longer than any letter I've written in my life. Nell manages Elsa's uncle's household and is quiet still, in the way she's chosen to be quiet, which is entirely different from how she was quiet in that first cabin. There is no fear in it now, just preference. Elsa is the one who kept the carbolic. She keeps it in the same pocket of her father's coat, which she still has, though the coat is too worn now to wear. It hangs on a peg by the back door. I look at it sometimes when I come in from the barn. She says I still favor my left side when I'm tired. She is correct. The scar is old and white now and doesn't cause me anything, but the body remembers what the mind lets go of, and when I'm tired I hold myself a certain way and she notices. She has been noticing for 30 years. I asked her once, this was maybe 5 years in, when we were past the point of being careful with each other. I asked her what she'd actually thought in that first moment in the cabin when I came through the door. She thought about it. She's honest with her thinking, always has been. She doesn't answer quickly when the question deserves time. She said, I thought you were going to be trouble. I said, you raised the hatchet. I did. And then... She looked at me, and then you said you'd get the wood. She paused. A man who comes through a door bleeding and his first thought is the fire. She shook her head. I knew. Knew what? She picked up my hand where it was lying on the table and held it between both of hers, the way her uncle had held mine in the trading post that first day, with that same deliberate weight. I knew, she said, that you were exactly what I thought you were. I didn't ask what that meant. I knew what it meant. Outside the window, the river was running. The sky had the flat white of late afternoon, same sky I'd woken up under in the snow all those years ago. The kind of light that doesn't give you anything to read. But I had everything I needed to read it anyway.